The people who liked me before, who don't think my current views are crazy, they still like me now. And the people who hated me before still do, because any acknowledgement of like statistical differences between groups is what they really care about. It's not about, if you're actually want to discriminate against people or if you actually hate anybody or anything like that. It's just they need to be in denial of reality. People are surprised by this, but like, of all the politics, like if you choose between like liberals, different kinds of liberals, like right wing populists, or like Republican establishment, I'm almost, probably closest to the Republican establishment, right? It's just the least bad option. I do like have a theory that like arbitrarily, like men having arbitrarily higher status than women, um, is probably good for fertility. I don't know how we engineer that. I don't know how we don't have the societal consensus to do that. If you could just like, transfer, $200,000 into the account of every man and keep everything else the same. Yeah, I think there's a good chance we'd have more marriages and more families. If you did the same for women, I don't think you, I don't think you would.
Richard Hanania is a writer, political scientist, and public intellectual. The last time we spoke on Upstream was 2 months ago, and in the time since, a lot has happened. 1, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down affirmative action. And 2, Richard was the subject of a controversial Huffington Post expose. We cover all this in the conversation ahead and dial in exactly how he defines his views and his politics. We also discuss the sexual revolution, fertility, and his upcoming debate with Curtis Yarvin. Without further ado, here's Richard. Richard, you're our first return guest besides Balaji back on the podcast. Thanks so much for coming back.
I wasn't aware. Well, yeah, I'm very honored. Glad to be here.
You've recently published your book, The Origins of Woke, which we talked about a bit last time, and we'll talk about this time. There's the beautiful cover. It's a great book. Highly recommend people order it right away. And recently, there was a failed attempt at cancellation by a reporter, which I gather only increased book sales and attention your way. It was interesting because there was this meme going around, kind of the unmasking Shaggy, where the joke was basically like that you had been very public with sort of your views, and that these sort of allegations, and it was basically sort of comments you made a very long time ago under a pseudonym, weren't this grand reveal. They were perhaps a bit more extreme versions of things perhaps you'd already been saying, but you did issue a post where you delineated between, hey, these are the things that I've changed my mind about and I no longer believe, and here are the things that said that I still do believe, that people are angry at, and that's why they tried to cancel me. Why don't you unpack the delineation there of what you used to believe that you no longer believe and what you still do believe as it relates to these topics?
Yeah, I mean, so, I came at sort of politics, in the younger days, sort of just, there are some obvious truths like, men and women are different, that groups differ in crime rate and, scores on standardized tests. Um, and so, like, I've never, like, I've always, like, taken that for granted. And I think, a lot of people just sort of see that and maybe they go in an extreme direction. And maybe I was one of them. Um, and I think that like and I think that like 15 years ago, it was more of a, well, we can just sort of, it was a more extreme version of it. It was sort of exaggerating these differences. It was saying they had like deep policy outcomes that involved like, either, in some way, either discriminating against people or treating them unfairly, or making generalizations about, what they can and can't do. Um, and, I reject that now. And that was like, 12, 15 years ago, like you said. But then, I'm not a leftist either, right? I didn't become a leftist and just deny reality, and say there's no racial differences, and men can be women and women can be men, and there's no difference between men and women anyway. I'm not, that stuff I still think is crazy. And so, the people who liked me before, who don't think my current views are crazy, they still like me now. And the people who hated me before still do, because any acknowledgement of like statistical differences between groups is what they really care about. It's not about, if you're actually want to discriminate against people or if you actually hate anybody or anything like that. It's just they need to be in denial of reality. And so that's sort of how this thing shook out. And, the people, like I said, I mean, those who were like already not offended by me, I mean, they just kept treating me the same, and it hasn't really changed all that much.
Yeah. And say more in terms of like where is the border between hey, we are acknowledging that differences exist versus hey, these are either exaggerations or we're treating people as a group in a way that we shouldn't. Like what is where is the border for you in terms of when it goes, what's the right way of thinking about it?
Yeah, it's so like for I think probably easier to speak in examples. So like obviously there's differences between men and women. Maybe you think men on average have better political views. Like maybe I think that's might be true. Like from my perspective, maybe I agree with men slightly more. And this is actually not even that radical a position. Like on the online right now, there's been like such a radicalization that like this doesn't sound that shocking. Where it might have like 10 years ago, like a lot of people think, oh, women's suffrage was bad or women should not be in leadership roles. Like actually, it's not. It's like I don't know about your audience, but like if you're online and you're on like the right wing Twitter sphere, that's like not even like that radical a thing to hear anymore, right? But I reject that. I'm more moderate than like sort of where a lot of online right wing people are these days. You can acknowledge the reality and be aware of it. And I've written articles about it. One women's tears and win in the marketplace of ideas for people who haven't seen that essay. And so, yeah, I'm aware of it, but it doesn't mean that, you go to the position that women shouldn't work and only should make babies and, have, no leadership role in society. Same thing with race. I mean, if the races, do differ on standardized tests or they differ in crime rates, we should still fight crime and we should still, try to, have the economy, do well and bring everybody, have technological progress and bring everyone's prospects up, right? Like when the leftists demand, equality of outcomes, I think that's a problem, and that is going to lead to hate and social strife, and people will push back on that and like sort of believe in inequality and just hold it up as like correct or true or natural. And I'm a believer that we should avoid both those traps. We should treat people as individuals. We should acknowledge statistical differences, take them into account. Like when it's relevant for policy or when it's relevant for cultural analysis or whatever. And then yeah, try to make humanity better off.
And so is it fair to say you're, I mean, basically in the classical liberal tradition, particularly as it relates to different groups of people on a race, like you're not suggesting we treat Asian people or white people any differently based on the differences there, or any other group, but perhaps you're a bit more sympathetic to, hey, maybe we should treat men and women slightly differently on certain issues, given that they are so biologically different. Or how would you think about where your capitalism starts and ends?
Yeah, I'm not even against treating ethnic groups differently if there's a relevant statistic that you can show that you don't, exaggerate, but you're not saying it because you hate the people. But like for example, police, right? The classic example is racial profiling. There are huge gaps in crime rate. I think I've seen that like the gap between I think like actually like I think it might have been 1 year or more than 1 year where Asian female like black females had a higher murder rate in the US than Asian males, right? So if you start to acknowledge that like cops should profile, like think groups of men are more dangerous than groups of women, of course, right? We all think that. If the gaps between races are that extreme, lock up every person of a certain race and you don't, harass them on that basis. But it's a statistical predictor, like anything, like people who wear, hoodies or people who, walk with their hands in their pockets or people who, whatever. I mean, it's just a statistical predictor. Some of these things we control, like how we dress and how we walk, and some of these things we don't control, like our age, our race, our sex. All of them are predictors. How we look, whether we look scary or whatever. I don't know if that's statistically predictive, but maybe it is. And we acknowledge that, like when cops, will profile on that basis in a market. So, like outside of police work, there's not that many examples where it's like obvious you can or you should treat people differently, right? If like groups differ on average, you can give them whatever test you want or whatever the benchmark is, and then hire them on the basis or hire, fire, promote. Once you see how productive they are. So yeah, the crime thing is important, and that's where a lot of the that's where a lot of the tensions are in our society. Liberals, get very mad about it, and the police say we don't profile, and of course they profile because they are human and they see patterns. And of course, like they would be brain dead. I mean, if they didn't profile at all, right? And so like the accusations are actually correct. Um, And so this is why it's such a source of tension. But then, like in most other things in society, yeah, we can say, don't care about group differences, don't care about differences in outcome, and treat people as individuals and try to make everyone better off.
But yeah, I guess the worry here is that it becomes self-fulfilling, that if a group has higher sort of degree of, police inquiries, that they're more likely to have, get caught for things that other groups that are maybe doing similar things, but just aren't looked into as a result. So there's some self-fulfilling. Are you dubious of this?
I'm very yeah, very doubtful. I mean, it's like, well, what is like this understanding of history? Like, there was this group who committed no crime. Then the police started suspecting him, and then their crime rate went up. Like, does it ever work? Like, it's like no. Like these groups come and they sometimes have high crime rates, and sometimes, like I think the Chinese were probably like there was probably racism against Chinese living in cities, in the early 20th century, but they didn't become criminals as a result. They have a very low crime rate today. We suspected Muslims during the war on terror. It's like there's pretty much no terrorism today. There really wasn't much terrorism during the 2000s when we were freaking out about it. It was statistically almost non-existent. And so yeah, I mean maybe men are just more violent because we treat them that way. But that's the yeah. It's sort of it's a strange. I mean, it's a very sort of strange thing, right? And like if you don't take it into account and you pretend like there are no differences, right? You're letting crime run rampant in these neighborhoods. Is that good for like reducing the crime rate of the group that has the high crime rate? Probably not.
Right. You had this post a long time ago. I'm curious how you've evolved since it, where you were talking about sort of French anti wokeness as a possible solution, and you were sort of referencing Thomas Chatterton Williams' reflection that in France they're truly colorblind. I guess they don't even think about race, they don't track race, and so he's treated as an individual there, and thus you don't have some of the extreme sort of corrective social engineering measures there, and that relates to a conversation I remember Charles Murray and Coleman Hughes had on their podcast, on Coleman's podcast, where Charles Murray wrote this book meant to sort of highlight group differences as a way to help explain that not everything is a result of prejudice, and he's saying the denial of these differences is causing us to have the improper tools in our toolkit to fight these differences, or think that they can be fought. And Coleman is saying that might be right, but to acknowledge those differences is so, and you get at this at your piece, I'm curious if you change your mind on it, is so disempowering, or so difficult for a society to deal with, and has all sorts of second order effects, that we should sort of push it under the rug.
Yeah, I mean, I would prefer not to think about it, and I and we don't think about most group differences, right? There are many white ethnic groups. Some have higher crime rates, some have higher incomes than others. We ignore them. One of the arguments of my book is the Hispanic category was sort of created, right? Nobody cares about the difference between Italians and whites if you call everyone else white. No one cares, right? But we care a lot about Hispanic. I argue, and I think I show that this is a result of racial classification on the part of government. And so, yeah, I mean, these are sort of uncomfortable things. Nobody wants to be, I don't care. Like, I'm an Arab, and like Jews are smarter than Arabs and beat them in wars. And like, I don't care. Right. It's like, I think we should have like an added, like, we should be encouraging people like not to have their sense of self like wrapped up with their sort of group identity. Um, but I think it's inevitable to some degree. But we can turn the salience up, or we can turn the salience down. I think in the French case, they do have these like massive crime differences. They have the religious thing with like the North African Muslim population. Um, I think they're not as bad on wokeness as we are. They didn't tear down the statues. They still can enforce, crime. They don't have like this entire, they don't have this entire regime of affirmative action and disparate impact. They still have riots every now and then. We still have riots every now and then, right? We probably, it didn't cure every possible thing or tension between, the police and and communities where there's a lot of crime. Um, but yeah, I think that it's just a matter of degrees. I mean, it's the I don't think like yeah, it's like you gotta first of all you have to just care about truth, right? You just want to be like some of us are just honest and want to tell the truth, and but it's not like something like every congressman should get up and talk about all the time. The problem is if you don't talk about it, the only people talking about group differences are like the Ibram Kendis of the world, and everyone else just sort of nervously like looks away and doesn't want to answer them, and that's sort of that's a problem too. And this is why I think it's so important to attack wokeness, to attack identity politics. You might not need to give them 100% truth to attack them. You might attack them with 70% truth. It could be enough to beat them. I mean, there's been pushback on wokeness. Just getting people to know it's important. Some people, have different degrees of understanding of like group differences. But yeah, just saying like these people are crazy and we could beat them. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be logically the most coherent thing in order to be politically effective.
Yeah. Well, let's get on that tech for a bit. Part of your book, I see it as advocating for a strategy that conservatives should use, which is not just focusing on culture, but actually focusing on law and politics. And when we think about, you mentioned, alluded to the fact that sort of wokeness is weaker now than it was a few years ago. I'm curious how much of that do you think has been law versus culture, or why don't you outline your case for how conservatives should kind of reorient their approach?
I think it is. I think it is. Yeah, law and culture. I mean, they're so interactive, right? And I can look at cultural. I mean, if you want to call Elon Musk buying Twitter a cultural factor, it is a cultural. It's just one man decided to do one thing, right? And I think that's been huge. Um, the SFFA v. Harvard case. I mean, we're only a few months here from the decision, and it seems to me that like there is like stories after story in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times about like how like universities don't know what to do, and like even corporate America has taken the hint about how the Supreme Court thinks about racial issues. um, and then you have that sort of like the that's sort of the just like that's just that decision. But you also have like sort of the taking the the more aggressive things like banning critical race theory in schools in these red states. There's the stuff on gender identity and not teaching it to kids, and there's the there's this the school choice, just taking power away from public schools completely. 10 states have adopted some form of universal school choice program. And like that will probably, I think that makes like teachers unions and these other nefarious forces sort of, they have to be a little bit careful, because now like they're seriously threatened. I mean, they really hate this voucher stuff because they dislike the idea of taking the taxpayer money and putting it in the hands of parents. Um and so yeah, it's 2020 was a peak. It was, it's easier to say that actually in retrospect. When I was going through the summer of we were all going through summer of 2020, I was wondering, I was really scared. Like, I was, for the only time in my life I've been like scared for the future of the country. I'm like, is this going to be like a descent into like the Middle Ages? I mean, it was nuts. It was like every corporation was like speaking like zombies. There were obviously riots in the streets. I'm like, had people just gone insane? um, and then no, it sort of, it calmed down. It's probably the COVID lockdowns and all that drove people crazy. And we went back to sort of like arguing about the same things like the last 60 years: affirmative action, disparate impact, crime, disproportionate rate. But like the pendulum swing, and like the pendulum's always been sort of swinging on these things. And so yeah, I think that the legal changes have been huge. And the cultural changes, I mean, like, yeah, I think they're following. I think they're being felt at the institutional level. I think when a DEI officer gets laid off, in response to some law or idea or lawsuit or idea that they might not be as necessary, the effect is not felt the next day. It's sort of a hidden effect, right? It's like that person is not in the corporation telling them to do all these crazy things, and so it's like you're tracing cause and effect. But you have to do it in an indirect way because the institutions are changing and shifting all the time, and new people are coming and going. And you sort of have to be like, you have to be paying very, very close attention to even have like a theory of what's going on. So yeah, overall, I mean, I think that like, I started writing this book a while ago. I mean, it was just released at the end of 2023. It was like complete, I think, like 6 or 7 months ago. And obviously, I was writing it for much longer than that. So it was like we were pretty close to 2020 when I started writing this book. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think the time since has really, I think I'm more confident in my arguments than less so. It's only been a year. I looked up the other day when did Elon Musk buy Twitter, because it feels like 5 years ago. I mean, it feels like so much has changed. It was literally a year ago, almost a year ago. And the SFA v Harvard decision was only 2 months ago. And if you said, would it change this much, more or less, I would have said not even this much. I would have said, oh, maybe this is something that's going to be years down the line. We'll see a little bit, but I see major changes of these, just like these two small things. And so, yeah, I'm optimistic on this issue.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Looking to give your startup a competitive edge? Meet Mercury. Mercury is banking for ambitious companies, a modern partner that can provide you with the tools and resources you need to turn your startup into the best version of itself. Say goodbye to the friction that comes with traditional banking. Mercury moves at the speed of startups. From creating an account to wiring money, a few clicks is all it takes. Mercury isn't just a place to hold and send money. It's software built to help you scale with safety and stability when you need to, whether you're a team of 2 or a team of 1,000. And Mercury goes beyond banking to remove the roadblocks to success, providing you with the connections, network, and guidance necessary to make your ambitions real. As a startup and Mercury customer myself, I've loved how easy it has been to scale my company's finances with Mercury. Visit Mercury.com to join more than 100,000 startups on Mercury, the powerful and intuitive way for ambitious companies to bank. That's Mercury.com. Mercury is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services provided by Choice Financial Group and Evolve Bank and Trust, members FDIC.
Compliance doesn't have to be complicated. In fact, with Vanta, it can be super simple. Trusted by over 5,000 fast-growing companies like Chili Piper, Patch, Gusto, and Juniper, Vanta automates the pricey, time-consuming process of prepping for SOC 2, ISO 27001, HIPAA, and more. With Vanta, you can save up to 400 hours and 85% of costs. Vanta scales with your business, helping you successfully enter new markets, land bigger deals, and earn customer loyalty. And bonus, our Moment of Zen listeners get $1,000 off Vanta. Just go to vanta.com/zen. That's VANTA.com/ZEN.
I think another thing that can't be understated, perhaps, is sort of the post-Trump, Trump not sort of giving sort of credibility to his enemies to sort of overreach in the name of stopping him. There was this argument right before the election that went along the lines of like, if you want what Trump wants, paradoxically, you want Biden to win because uh, Trump, helps his enemies and hurts his friends. Basically, he can't help himself. And I'm curious if you're sympathetic to that argument, and two, are you also sympathetic to it in 2024? Like, if Trump wins, do we go back to this sort of crazy, world that was? Yeah.
You talking right now. I just had a thought that I hadn't thought before. I think it was what happened. So Trump, I think there's what I previously thought was there's a fatigue. It's just like Trump came, but then he becomes part of, like, he says racist and sexist things, and he's like this guy, but like whatever. He had one term. We've gone through another presidential term. He's going to have another term. It's like you can only get outraged at Trump so many times, right? But the other thing, I think January 6th might have actually been good for the anti-wokeness cause, because the narrative before was that Trump is racist and sexist. Those are the main things about him. So the left responded by being, anti-racist and anti-sexist. Now, like, his racism and sexism is almost in the background. He's calling for the Mark Milley to be executed. He's saying, "I'm going to purge the government and take control." So he's like, just open, like, contempt for like all American institutions and norms. Like, the racism is not even like salient. Like, it's not one of the things even people think about Trump now. And now, so I guess the reaction has been like liberals become like pro law enforcement or something, right? Because like that's who Trump hates. So they like the criminal justice system, and they like the military, and they like law enforcement, instead of focusing their energy on like being anti-racist or anti-sexist. Yeah, I mean, I just had this thought, but it makes perfect sense. It's like the salience of why Trump is scary to liberals has changed since January 6th from racism and sexism to anti-democratic, and I think that's a big difference.
If Trump wins in 2024, do you think we go back to this crazy era, or what do you think?
No, I mean for those two reasons. I just think the fatigue of Trump, and then plus the it'll still be there. It'll still be the story will always be what's he like? Is he firing the director of CIA or trying to get him to do his bidding or whatever? Yeah, I mean there is a thermostatic public opinion where like, and what's scary for the Republicans is that that hasn't happened at least in elections, like where public opinion goes the opposite of whoever the president is. And so you would think conservatives would be doing well in like these midterm and off year elections, and they're not doing particularly well. But the culture at the same time does seem to be, like we talked about, moving in the right direction. So if Trump wins, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think it stops. I don't think it stops the train because you know what the laws. Because I think that where the conservative movement is now, thanks to my book and what other people have been saying, is that it's going to do the right thing on the policy. Even Trump, who's not paying much attention, is going to put in people who are conservative and they're ideological and they're going to do good things on civil rights law and education and so forth. And like the liberals, I think will be so distracted with democracy and making sure like Trump doesn't like become friends with Putin and like sell out Ukraine. That's going to be like the major like focus. Like, what's he going to do about Ukraine? And there's no way he's going to be able to. I think, in my opinion, it's no, it's off topic, but there's no way he's going to be able to like pull out of Ukraine. He's just going to be. That's all the pressure from both sides of the aisle are going to be towards him taking a tough line and not being seen as soft on Putin and so forth. And so, yeah, I mean, the anti wokeness movement can sort of yeah, I maybe move under the radar while the people in the Trump administration do the good thing, and the culture just keeps shifting in the right direction. That's sort of the the hopeful sort of forecast.
What do you make of sort of the establishment, kind of anti-establishment? It seems that Vivek, DeSantis have their own versions of kind of like, dismantle the administrative state, or sort of like anti institutions, or that these institutions need, have failed us, need to be better. And at the same time, you've people, it's almost like Sam Harris and Ezra Klein are now like bedfellows, where you have like Sam Harris defending the institutions, and critiquing the people who are critiquing them. You've talked about like populism makes us dumber. You have kind of nuanced thoughts about it. Where do you kind of stand on this like high level conversation?
I think there's like the idea about like this deep state. A lot of it is just like I don't believe. Like a lot of it is just the Republican Party has become populist, but populist not meaning like what people think about like economically, like wanting redistribution or something like that. It's populist in the sense that like the masses just love Trump, and like his personal grievance and his personal soap opera is what they're invested in. Right. So a lot of this, like dismantle, the FBI and stuff, it's just purely because Trump is in legal jeopardy. You can't win with these people because it's like if they don't arrest Democrats, they're not arresting Democrats. If they do, they're just trying to show that they're fair or whatever. And so like a lot of this anti law enforcement stuff is just pure Trump cult of personality. And I think that's like what DeSantis and Vivek are playing to. Um, and then, like, there's a deeper sort of conservative critique. There's a more substantive one, the critique towards the administrative state. And there was a Trump executive order near the end where he was going to make it easier to fire bureaucrats, right? So it's like an open question. Like the president appoints like a few thousand people. And then everyone else is basically not able to be fired. But the president can change that through executive order. And Trump tried to do that near the end, and then Biden reversed it. And so there is like a sense that like there is like a serious thing here where like conservatives understand that most bureaucrats are liberal. And you can basically, if you have more direct political control, like, the way judges work, judges are just appointed by Republicans or Democrats, whoever wins the elections. But so therefore conservatives have representation in the way that they really don't in the federal bureaucracy, where most employees are just permanent. And then you could do, all kinds of things, presumably on COVID, on, down the line of whatever conservative priorities are. And so that's like, so yeah, there's this cult of personality thing with just Trump. It's going to be interesting because, he could win. I mean, I think he's the most likely, he's by far the most likely Republican nominee, has a good chance of winning. I think the odds of us getting a Republican president who is not Trump in 2025 is very low, because I think Trump's going to be the nominee. And so like yeah, there's going to be both aspects of this. There's going to be him doing, like, if he's in office, doing his personal, his personal grievances and vendettas, and then also, like, to a lesser extent, the conservative movement getting some of its priorities by taking more control over the bureaucracy. And who knows how it'll turn out. But once Trump is off the scene, and that might not be for a while. I think he could run for president for 5 more times and always be the nominee. But when he is off the scene, maybe it might take 10 or 20 years. These ideas about taking more control of the federal bureaucracy on the right will still be there. And I think, yeah, we're going to see interesting political changes.
Well, it's kind of the flip side, or the corollary to the thesis in your book, which is, civil rights laws might superficially ban discrimination, but are reinterpreted by judges to require it. And so, if judges can just decree that the law means the exact opposite of what it says, it can't only be fixed by changing the laws, right? You have to change the people who are interpreting the laws as well.
Unquestionably correct. Yeah, when people ask me what's the impact of SFFA v. Harvard, I say it depends on who's going to win in 2024 and which, who controls the Senate, because it's like, yeah, liberals are going to interpret it in a certain way and conservatives are going to interpret it a certain way. Do you keep going, or do you defer to the universities when they say, oh, we really didn't discriminate? Or what, right? It's like sort of you lob an artillery shell at the enemy and they scatter. And if you don't have any more artillery to send over, you don't have another strike, they'll regroup and basically be able to do the same thing that they were doing before, right? If you hit them and they scatter and then you start, massacring them, you have other weapons. And that's, then you're going to have a long-term impact. You're eventually going to beat them, right? And so, yeah, I mean, all these things are steps. And what happens now, I mean, like, it's sort of, the Supreme Court is under their, like, there's no way for them to get rid of conservative Supreme Court justices. So at least the conservatives have that, no matter, they could not have another person to appoint even in the next presidency. But, the lower courts and all the bureaucrats and everything else is going to depend on elections. And then, of course, the Supreme Court and who decides to retire when, and, what strategies they hold, that's all going to depend on who the president is. And so, yeah, this isn't like a one decision or one policy. I mean, it's a continuous dialectic and process.
Yeah. Let's go deeper on the sort of critique that David Sachs makes. I've heard Mark Andreessen make this in podcasts too, where there's kind of this sort of like um, this group of people. It represents a minority of the country, but they run sort of the key institutions, sort of the cathedral or oligarchy idea, and they sort of determine a set of values or set of policies on behalf of the country. Um, even though it's a minority position, not supported by the rest of the country. And part of that is values based, but also part of it is they've done a really bad job at their jobs. And that this is happening in the US, but also perhaps happening in Israel, perhaps happening in other countries. And Sachs tend to use words like our elites are bad, our elites institutions are broken. This is kind of a tech right position more broadly. Do you sympathize with that critique? Do you think it's incorrect? What do you make sense of it?
I mean, compared to what, right? I say like a basketball player is good or bad. I mean, am I talking about a professional player or a high school player? I generally expect government to be bad. Are we bad in like global or historical terms? Maybe not. I don't think so. It's hard for me to see that case. I think the certain areas, yeah, like civil rights, COVID. I think public health is in uh, really bad shape. But it seems like every other country was also in bad shape too. I mean, they all, some of them were worse than us, had like mask mandates for much longer, and were not many did like human challenge trials. I think the UK might have done a few, near the middle or the end of the pandemic. And so, yeah, they have problems. And like the government is so vast, like, law enforcement. I think, the conservatives hate the FBI. I think it does a good job. Like Trump was innocent in Russiagate. He wasn't prosecuted. He's guilty in this other stuff. He is being prosecuted. Right. I do think law enforcement works pretty well in this country, even down to the level of local police. Like, people have been in third world countries where they take bribes and stuff. I mean, I think we have relatively low levels of that kind of corruption, given the constraints of like, what cops can and can't do in this country, which there are a lot of constraints. And then, public health is pretty bad. Civil rights, even what they're doing is sort of illegitimate. Like the Federal Reserve and like monetary, I don't have any expertise to judge, whether they're doing good or bad things. So yeah, it really does depend on the area.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. If you're a startup founder or executive running a growing business, you know that as you scale, your systems break down and the cracks start to show. If this resonates with you, there are three numbers you need to know: 36,000, 25, and 1. 36,000. That's the number of businesses which have upgraded to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the number one cloud financial system, streamline accounting, financial management, inventory, HR, and more. 25. NetSuite turns 25 this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days, not weeks, and drive down costs. One, because your business is one of a kind, so you get a customized solution for all your KPIs in one efficient system with one source of truth. Manage risk, get reliable forecasts, and improve margins. Everything you need all in one place. Right now, download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist, designed to give you consistently excellent performance, absolutely free, at netsuite.com/upstream. netsuite.com/upstream to get your own KPI checklist. netsuite.com/upstream. What's your framework for where your sort of classical liberalism starts and ends, or where in certain cases do you overlap with sort of that bundle of beliefs and or positions, and where do you differ from that bundle of positions?
Yeah, I think I'm going to write an essay on this. Yeah, I believe in, I believe in markets. I believe in democracy. I believe in, kind of utilitarianism, but not total utilitarianism, right? There is like a sense of like being smart is better than being dumb. Like, higher culture is better than lower culture. Like beauty is more important than ugliness. There is that. Where does it begin and where does it end? Yeah, I mean, it really depends. Like I do like value. Like I mean, I do have like values that are not simply total. Like I do value individual liberty. I think like all else equal, you want to be a free person. More than a person who's, and some people have a different view. Some people actually they like the idea of like a society where we all take care of each other and we're dependent on each other, and that's like, I'm not against that if that's like the best arrangement necessarily, but it's not something that I think is good for its own sake. Same thing with something like, equality. I mean, should we say Nietzschean? I mean, it's like, good things are better than bad things. Is that Nietzsche or is there somebody else? I mean, does that just come under utilitarianism? I don't know. It feels like a little bit different. But I don't go in this direction where it's like all artistic and aesthetic pleasure and we have like a ancient Sparta, but it's cool. It's cool. We're all suffering and we're all slaves because like, we built something cool, like and beautiful. Like I don't go that far.
I think the classic critique of classical liberalism, or even sort of this, like, in our last episode, we talked about how you're just more of a normal, right winger, more like the Jeb Bush, or there were a couple other names you mentioned, is that they are too squishy, perhaps, or that they don't have enough sort of like substance to defend themselves against people who weaponize their own values of tolerance and freedom against them, and aren't willing to like that there is a straight line between sort of liberalism and sort of extreme progressivism, that line, like Jonathan Rauch can't stand up to the sort of the far left because he's not willing to cross some of the sacred sort of principles of liberalism, which include like equality, the parts around equality. How do you make sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is like it's an attitude thing. Like, Republican establishment is, mostly against affirmative action and these kind of things. But like, if you ask them why, they're not hiring any women to be their leaders, they'll say, "Oh my goodness, we have to do so much better, and we're so sorry." And this and that, and it's like, the correct response is like "f you," like I don't care. It's like you're basically lying, and I don't believe in like Trumpian, like just, call everyone a deep state, scumbag who should be executed. But like, there has to be a more substantive response than just like, you're correct. And, it's just sort of accidentally, we ended up in this place where we didn't have as much diversity as you. Sorry, we'll do better next time. There's substantive things. I mean, like, they're sort of in hock with the Christian right, which I'm not a fan of. They're actually, traditionalists as far as like a lot of these social issues, which I'm not. People are surprised by this, but like, of all the politics, like if you choose between like liberals, different kinds of liberals, like right-wing populists, or like Republican establishment, I'm almost, probably closest to the Republican establishment, right? It's just the least bad option.
Yeah. And maybe if there was like an edit to the classical liberalism where you took the equality part out, you're almost like an inequality based, sort of classical liberal in terms of you believe in freedom, but you're not a libertarian in the sense that you think using the government, whether it relates to crime or military or other things, helps defend these freedoms that we have. And maybe that's where Republican establishment has ended up.
Yeah, yeah, that they have in a way. I mean, I don't think the libertarian position, even though that people confuse this because a lot of libertarians are sort of soft on crime. I don't think the libertarian position, they believe in arresting, people for murder and robbery and so forth. And like, this is just a technical issue of how much power the police have or, what tools exactly they use. I mean, I do think that like, I do agree with the libertarians. Like I'm against prosecuting like victimless crimes. Like I saw this thing. I don't know if you see this on Twitter, where this one female conservative journalist was like in New York City, and like prostitutes are walking the streets, and they're like, they're prostitutes, like they're foreign, I think they're Asian, and they're like trying to like pull men in, and it's like the city is going like businesses and locals complain like why do they care? Why do they care? Like it seems to be pretty I don't know if like I had prostitutes working on my neighborhood would I care? Probably not all that much. I mean, if they were doing it quietly and not bothering anyone else. And so, yeah, I mean, the libertarians do like show like, they do like the reporting on this stuff is sometimes very good. Like they show these like police doing these like SWAT team raids on like these massage parlors with happy endings, and you're like, why are they doing? Why are the cops like doing this? And it makes no sense. It just seems crazy. And going against people for like gambling and like poker games and just like these weird stuff. And so yeah, I do think that the sort of the Republicanist, and then this is like I'm just talking general the conservative movement, everything from like the Christian right to like Trump to like the GOP establishment. It is sort of it is a weird sort of combination of like I said this on Twitter the other day, like Christianity and paganism. It's like because I was pointing to this poll where like they asked him like which one of these guys is like a true like a person of faith, and like they were more likely to say Trump was a person of faith than anyone else in the and he's like Trump is than Pence or like any of these people, and it just seems like the Trump cult is really, I mean, he's not Christian in like any sense, right? Like even the way he defends abortion is funny. I mean, or he attacks abortion is funny. Like he says he's pro-life. I remember during the 2016 campaign, he would be like, "Oh, I knew this woman who was going to get an abortion, and then her son was born, and now he's a superstar. He's just great." And like usually the Christian conservatives are like, "There's some, you want to abort this baby with a handicap," and like, but to Trump, it's like the fact that like somebody could turn out great and like not be aborted is like the way he defends it, right? I mean, it's just like a very like non-Christian thing, the way he even caters to them. And it's like it's sort of this, and there is sort of like this, the American right wingers are more likely to believe in, the death penalty, obviously not being fans of welfare, being tough on crime. I mean, there are these things that are, really just sort of pagan or social Darwin, but like mixed in with Christianity. I mean, it's I'm not sure like how to think about it, but I think Trump really does represent it. And I think it's like something that's very interesting and underexplored,
Yeah.
like Nietzschean Christian nationalism, right?
Yeah, yeah, fascinating. You wrote recently about sort of the Bari Weiss sort of debate that she hosted with a few sort of women thinkers on sort of has the sexual revolution been good for women? Louise Perry, Sarah Hayter, Anna Kay from Red Scare, and a few others. And is it fair to say your take was that maybe in some ways it hasn't been good, but also we should continue to just give people the freedom to to make their own decisions? Or where did you net out
Yeah.
on this?
Is it? Yeah, I think Sarah Hyder, was really impressive. She really, like one of them, Louise Perry said, today women like are, they feel like, they're coerced into sex, this hookup culture. And she's like, and Hyder's like, like marital rape wasn't illegal in like most American states until like the 1970s, right? I mean, it's like, coerced sex, did that just start with the sex, coerced sex? It has to start with the sexual revolution. Of course not. It's hard to, say it's like from a like utilitarian perspective, right? It's like anything that reduces the number of healthy babies being born is like by necessity bad, right? And I'm good with that. Like I can bite that bullet, that utilitarian bullet. At the same time, there are societies where they have the worst of all worlds, and that they're like social conservative, but they don't have kids either. And I'm thinking of East Asia. I'm thinking of like Southern Catholic parts of Europe. And so like, yeah, I don't think like not having the sexual revolution necessarily gets you more families and babies. Maybe it does. Maybe it just makes you like a sterile, people who are just like, I can't have babies out of wedlock, but I can't do anything. And if I don't get married and I die alone, that's fine too. And so, yeah, overall, I do think that, freedom. So, freedom is good from that perspective. I think that a lot of our solutions are going to be to like fertility and the human enhancement. It's going to come from like things like embryo selection, genetic engineering. I think more freedom in like the reproductive space is like the way you get there. I think it's like sorry, you can't imagine a socially conservative, like almost theocratic regime going straight to like genetic engineering and embryo selection, right? It's just or IVF, all these things. I mean, it's hard to imagine. It's sort of a necessary step. And so, yeah, I think overall, I come down on sexual revolution has not failed. It's it's got its problems, but I think it's inevitable and necessary.
Do you think it's inevitable that sort of dynamics that Louise Perry talks about in terms of casual sex, hurting women, relative to men, and that it makes men less likely to commit, and thus women, less likely to have children? I'm painting a broad brush, but do you think those are accurate and just inevitable?
I do think that it is. It's true that casual sex is bad for women, and it's true that like a lot of the sexual marketplace is like predatory, right? It's like aggressive and like smooth, charismatic, or smart, assertive men are gonna like often like manipulate women or take advantage of them. Um, Life is like this. I mean, and free markets. I mean, that's going to happen too, in like business and other places too. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, there is truth to that, and the truth that like women may be unhappy. I don't think casual sex is good for women. I think there's evolutionary reasons to doubt that's the case, and I think there's data on like people going out and having a lot of sex and women not being mentally healthy necessarily when they do that, and I think there's a lot of evidence of that. But it's like, what does it mean to like restrict that, right? I think there's gonna it's like with the social media, it comes and it causes all kinds of problems. It comes with like addictions, right? But like people do adjust. People see that like, okay, this thing that like didn't like, it's like a new drug comes on the market, like, oh, we put cocaine into like Coca-Cola. uh we think, okay, maybe cocaine is bad, maybe it needs to be restricted, and then like we have less cocaine now, it's not like as freely available, and people just there's not the laws change and sort of the societal attitudes change. I think we're gonna, I think we're seeing something like that with social media. We're seeing something like that with porn. Like a lot of states have effectively, I think, banned Pornhub or something. I mean, there has been like they had some ID verification requirements, and the porn providers weren't able to comply with it, or at least some of them weren't. Um, and so, yeah, I do think that like this, men, women, sex. I mean, I think it does take some adjusting, and I think we're doing it. We're probably it might adjust in cycles. Like it might be like like we forget like what solutions we had, and
Yeah,
like we go back to being crazy. But I don't think it permanently just gets worse and gets crazier, because at least
totally.
there's either things get better, we adjust, or there's a cycle where at least for a time things get better until people sort of forget what they learned.
A better question is more like, should there be a cultural shading or a cultural guidance, or a cultural norm? And
Oh yeah, I'm not against that.
I think the one bigger, unless like, I think people should be able to make decisions that determine their own happiness. I'm less interested in like, paternalism there, but I am more interested in when it comes to fertility, and we note the fertility decline, because that does sort of affect things beyond one's own happiness. If you were in charge of trying to increase fertility based on your sort of understanding of the literature, or just what's out there, what do you think are interventions that could be that could make sense, or could move the needle, or what do you think there?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I don't like. There are broad lessons we can learn. Like, there seems to be like, it seems like when people sort of are exposed to modernity, it seems like fertility goes down. It seems to be negatively correlated with wealth. I mean, I think if I don't know. I don't think there are easy levers to pull. I do think this is a mostly cultural issue. I think that, like, and I think we just shouldn't just worry about fertility. I think we should worry about, quality of the population. We don't want to permanently get dumber. And on that account, I mean, I do think that just like, highly educated, smart people talking about fertility and like that it's a good thing and like modeling the behavior, I think is good. I mean, I'm for the technological solutions, like extending women's, pushing back menopause. There's been some articles on like scientists and startups working on this. Things like, I'm a big fan of like, surrogacy. I mean, there's a market case of like, high, women who like, make a lot of money, like contribute a lot economically, their time being valuable, and to like sell, to basically be able to have their own children, but use women who maybe are not, don't have as many skills to contribute economically, or not, contribute that much to society in the economic realm. I think it just makes perfect sense. I would like encourage that. People are afraid of commodification, but that's stupid. People say that about, like every human advancement. Um, and so yeah, I don't have policy solutions. I don't believe like the things people talk about, like, oh, make daycare a little more affordable, oh, have this tax credit or that. Like, no, like that's not gonna. I mean, maybe if you make it big enough, like $1 million a year, or something like that. I do think that there could be like I do like have a theory that like arbitrarily like men having arbitrarily higher status than women, um, is probably good for fertility. I don't know how we engineer that. I don't know how we don't have the societal consensus to do that. We don't know how to do that without like wrecking the economy. And like if you're like trying to socially engineer that men arbitrarily have higher status, that's like going to create a backlash, and they won't get status that way. It sort of just has to naturally, happen. I just think we should model the right behavior and look for technological solutions. That's just not a confident answer in what we can do.
And you're saying men having higher status than women because then women will respect them and want to have kids with them, basically?
Yeah, I mean, just like the relationships will form. I mean,
Yes.
and nature will take its
Yeah.
course. There was a I think a paper a while ago. Like, so South Dakota had this like boom, this oil boom, like 10, 15 years ago, and marriage didn't go up, but like the fertility rate went up. And what happens when you have this oil boom? It's like there's these high paying jobs that can go to uneducated men, like they can go make six figures, like doing this really hard labor that women really can't do. And it was like a shock that like increased like male status in that area and just in South Dakota. And the fertility marriage, I think my recollection is marriage didn't go up, but fertility went up. Just like the people who were married had kids, and maybe there were kids out of wedlock. And I see that as like evidence, just like that arbitrary just shock. If you could just like transfer $200,000 into the account of every man and keep everything else the same, yeah, I think there's a good chance we'd have more marriages and more families. If you did the same for women, I don't think you I don't think you would. And so yeah, I mean, there's something to just sort of consider and think about.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, Elon's got 10 kids, but if AOC had 10 kids and Taylor Swift had 10 kids, and I don't know, you get enough representative sample of people who people really admire, perhaps that would move the needle.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, I mean, like we talk about like society solving its own problems. I did look at the mom influencer. Like, I did read this article on this recently in Vanity Fair or Harper's, one of these fancy magazines, where they were complaining about it. And I looked in some of these accounts, and they have ridiculous 6 or 7 figure follower account of these like quote unquote trad wives. I don't think they call themselves trad wives. That's just like an internet thing, but they're just basically mom influencers. And yeah, I don't know. Like maybe that'll be the thing, and that'll shift us in the right direction.
Yeah. I want to segue into immigration. You wrote a blog post talking about diversity is our strength. As it relates to that, you had this great debate or discussion with Amy Wax a couple of years ago, where she was worried that immigrants won't assimilate, and you were saying, hey, perhaps they assimilate in some weird, they're less woke than Americans. I.e., if you care about that, maybe they assimilate even better to kind of the traditional American values that Amy holds dear.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Why don't you trace a little bit your evolution on immigration and where you overlap or differ from someone like Brian Kaplan, for example, who's extreme open borders.
Yeah, did you see this article that I just tweeted, but it's been out for a little while, by Bronze Age Pervert, called "The Populist Movement Never Happened"? It's interesting. The BAP is a interesting thinker, and this this article is like, it does. I just was wondering if you were thinking about that, because there was so much that I agreed with in the article, but it had sort of the standard, almost Amy Wax view um, of immigration. Yeah, I mean, I used to think that, like, first of all, I think that, like, sort ethnic tension is like sort of natural in society. I don't necessarily think that anymore. I came to see sort of the divisions between, like, all the different kinds of whites in this country and, like, Hispanics is very, very artificial and very, very dependent on government classification. And with migration, we're basically talking about Hispanics. I mean, like, Italians and, like, to Guatemalan. That's that spectrum is not, to me, like, so important, right? Like these, not like, it's not like South Africa, right, where you have these Northern Europeans and these sub-Saharan Africans, right? That's not the immigration we're talking about. We're talking about a very mixed country taking in more mixed people, right, with, like, different different percentages of various ancestries. And so there's that, and then there's the idea that, like, they vote for the left, which is the other anti-immigration case. I mean, first of all, the pro-immigration case is just utilitarianism, pure economics. More people is good. More people getting out of poverty is good. More workers is good. It's a simple argument. So you have to. I don't think you need, like, somebody who believes in free markets. I don't think you need to, like, sell the pluses. I think they're clear. Okay, so then you have this idea that, like, you'll get societal tension because groups are different. I really, this was like a big source of contention with Amy Wax, because Amy Wax is a conservative, and, like, all conservatives, they spend 95% of their focus on how much they hate white liberals born in America. There are very few, they complain very little about immigrants or the things that they do. And so it's like, you want this, like, cultural unity where you hate half of, like, okay, maybe they don't hate their fellow half of Americans, but you're driven crazy by, like, half of your fellow Americans. It's like, are they going to be more culturally distant from you than, like, drag queen, story hour or whatever, like, whatever's, angering you about liberals the most? Probably not, right? And so, so, I don't think that that makes sense. There's the idea, the attention idea doesn't make sense. The idea that they'll vote for the left, I just don't think it's, like, yes, like, by a little bit, but, like, you look at the polls now, and Trump is like 40-45% with Hispanics. You're going to project, for the next 60 years, or 50-40 years or whatever, that, they're always going to be majority Democrat. Like, no, these things shift pretty fast. So it's like, maybe a consideration, and maybe you expect it's going to be like, maybe that's the best expected value for, like, whatever they're voting now is what they're going to vote in the future. But it's really endogenous. I mean, how you treat immigration and how you approach the issue is obviously going to have an impact on that, and, like, everything else. And, you want conservatives to do other things smartly that will win over whites, and hopefully that will win over other groups too. And so, yeah, I mean, you take all this, and, you end up in a place where, like, the arguments for immigration are strong, the arguments against are sort of lacking. And then, yeah, I mean, I'm pretty pro. I think America has, the current immigration system. I think we can handle more people. I don't see any evidence that we're, beyond whatever the ideal point of, beyond whatever the ideal numbers are, that we're anywhere past that curve.
Balaji would say something like, we should treat immigration the way a company would treat immigration, which is let in people who make a positive difference, or up level the talent base, and not let in people who wouldn't fit the bar of your company in the same way. Like, do you think a country should operate in the same way?
The analogy doesn't. I mean, I don't know that, it's like the people have this analogy that, you put a fence on your country because, you put a fence, you would put a fence on your home. And it's like, no, it's not the good analogy. Like, I don't put a TV up in, like, the Rio Grande Valley and my couch and sit there. I mean, it's like, it's not the same thing. And, like, yeah, it's just a weird, it's a facile ideology. Like, you could think of it as like a corporation. You could think of the country as a house, but it's not either of those things. I don't think those, like, sort of metaphors really help.
Are you sympathetic with the idea that countries should have the right, should be thinking about their sort of demographics? Like, hey, if we're French and we're getting sort of, we have too big of a Muslim influence in our country, we should, be able to, or Israel, or I don't know, name your country that is sensitive to maintaining a majority of sort of like natural French, or whatever that means. Do you think that those countries are acting against their own interests, or and I'm curious how we should think about it in the U.S.
I think there is a I think there is an aesthetic component of like I like knowing that something like Japan exists and something like France exists. Um, and it's hard to balance against like the economic and utility. Like, I don't know, like what the like how you input it. Like, how do you balance these things? I mean, I don't know, like if anyone has a good answer to these things. In the American context, though, I mean, when you're already, like which I focus on mostly, when you're already sort of, this very mixed country, and you're sort of your thing is like being a global empire and being like the source of innovation and dynamism, right? And it's like it makes less sense to me in that context, right? Because there's not much of a common culture, and to the extent that there is, it is like a freedom, classical liberalism, like dynamism, move towards the future, which like restricting immigration and trying to preserve the demographics is like not, that's not consistent with that. You're sort of acting against you're acting sort of against your creed or your national identity. And I would say the same for like these nations like Canada, for example, maybe the UK to a certain extent. I mean, like, it's historically an empire. I mean, that's why it's the United Kingdom. It's not just England. um and so, yeah, I mean, maybe like a world, like maybe a world where, yeah, I don't know, like, and I do think that like these countries, like if there is a world where like the UK and the US, now that I think about it, and like Canada, they open up, and like France and Japan just like close down, it's not going to be good for France and Japan in the long run. They're going to be stagnant. They're going to be poorer country. We're seeing this to a certain extent. I mean, we're seeing, we are seeing this. And then, are they poorer and happier? Are they poor and happier? I mean, I don't know. Like I sort of like think maybe like nations is too crude. Like preserving cultures is fine, but a nation is probably too crude of a way to do that, right? The scale is too large, right? Freedom of association. You have an Amish culture in this country, and we do have a Hindu culture and a Muslim culture and a Jewish culture. A Japanese culture of some kind will survive in Japan, and I would let it go like for like I would like allow like localities even. We used to have like restrictive covenants, which of course are today seen as bad because they kept up people of a certain race. But like Jimmy Carter's latest the Jimmy Carter when he was running for president said he wouldn't like interfere with attempts to like change the ethnic profile of a neighborhood. Like, yeah, I'm for freedom. I mean, people can do that. If entire nations, want to do that, maybe I'm sort of skeptical. That's like it's like a consensual thing with the entire nation. Usually, it's just like one political movement or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I do think we should be, we should be thinking about sort of, more outside of the box of like these are just nations and they're just going to stay the way they are forever, and then we're all going to just be happy being different. I don't think that's like good for dynamism or progress or growth, and I don't think it's the way humanity moves forward.
I'm curious, do you think countries should not care about their kind of Gini coefficient or sort of the inequality within countries? Eric Weinstein or others would make the argument that when it gets too big, then you have higher chance of violence or unrest. Is that a specious argument, or what do you think is sort of the like should be a country's perspective to its own sort of wealth inequality, and if you defend some level of inequality, what's the best defense that would could convince someone who really cares about it, which
I think really it is like racial classification. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like a thing that if you think about it, like, does the average person have any way of knowing? Okay, so like I've seen people say stuff like a CEO used to make, I don't know, some made up number, 40 times more than an employee. Now he makes 300. Does a person in any way feel the difference between a 40x or 300? I can't imagine. Like, does he go into his house and says, okay, his TV is only this big, and like, he's only eating this food this fancy, but not too fancy? It's just not really plausible, especially since most people are not associating much with people of other social classes, especially today. I mean, they're just getting ideas of like the rich and like whether they're justified or not justified. I mean, it's just they're getting it off TV or the newspaper or whatever, right? So it is like it does strike me as a silly argument. And of course, there's people who claim to have data for this. One of them is Peter Turchin. I've had tweet threads and short parts of Substack posts, never done like a full takedown. But yeah, I'm not a fan of Turchin. I think he's pretty much a charlatan. I don't use that word often, but I mean, I think his data and his use of data is just terrible. And so, yeah, it's one of those things I would prefer not to think about, and I prefer what others would not to think about. I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that that's a problem.
and with instead we should be concerned about is our poor people's lives better, basically? Like, is there
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
or is it getting
Overall,
better?
overall growth.
Yeah.
Yeah, overall growth. I mean, and it's just a yeah, it's a weird thing, right? It's like capitalism proved better than socialism, and then we came and then we said, okay, well, it's inequality, and it's like I don't see any evidence. Like, yeah, like intellectuals, like certain intellectuals really hate it. I don't see income inequality. Like I see passion for trans. For and against trans. I see passion for stopping the police or stopping crime. Right. I don't see much passion for economic redistribution. But I think it's just these intellectuals, maybe some of these people who earn like 70,000 a year as assistant professors, like not liking people in business earning a lot more money than them. I sort of look for the psychological explanation here.
What about Occupy? I mean, there've been some sort of,
Yeah,
populist.
yeah. I mean, it did sort of. Yeah, you're right. It was there for a while. It was weird because it was the news.
Right.
Um, because of the bank bailouts, and there was also the Tea Party. I mean, it also
Yeah.
had that populist thing, which was just like don't care. That seemed to be like the businesses were the banks. It wasn't just the inequality. It was like people were hurting and they were getting bailed out and they were getting special privileges, right? So even that doesn't seem to be like caring about inequality. It's like when the government stepped in to really help these people and keep them afloat, that's when it seems like people got really upset.
Yeah. I want to segue into talking about Curtis Yarvin briefly, because you have a upcoming debate with him in Los Angeles, and I want to uh, sort of share what I think are some of his bigger ideas and get your perspective, not only on those ideas but just broadly where you overlap or differ from him. So one of the ideas, which I know you write about in your book, that's a treatise against it, is he believes detachment is the effective strategy until you have a way to win. So he thinks fighting back is not only futile but empowers the enemy, unless you truly have a way to win. That sort of doubles in the details there. So he's not a
So
fan of.
is I want to be clear. I sometimes I try to read Curtis and I talk to Curtis and I'm not always clear exactly. I think when people criticize me, but I think very rarely do people think I'm unclear about what I think or what people should do. So does that mean he thinks like nobody should be in politics, nobody should vote, nobody should form a political action committee, nobody should comment on politics? Is that his view?
Um, uh, you'll find out when you debate him. That's a good question. I'm not sure exactly
Okay.
where he draws the line. I know that he thinks Christopher Rufo's actions are counterproductive. I wonder if he still thinks they're counterproductive, given that they've had
What
so.
does he think like a governor? Like, what does he think like somebody in DeSantis' position do, if anything? Like, should he do nothing? What should he do?
Um, I'm not sure. I think what he would point to is he would point to Biden being empowered. Like he would point to Trump being worse for the right than Biden. Basically, like if you care about rightist sort of values or conservative values or policies or proposition, like he would maybe point that as an example.
Yeah, I think that's just wrong. I mean, if you care about abortion, yeah, abortion clinics are closing. You had lower taxes under Trump. Now you had the affirmative action ban. Yeah, it's like you could talk about the backlash to Trump, but yeah, I think overall you still take it.
Yeah. Well, I know you disagree there. Let me share a couple of his points. One is he thinks that he's a monarchist. He thinks that the most effective companies in the world or organizations in the world are run by a CEO, and he's not suggesting that people don't vote anymore, but he's suggesting that whoever people vote for should have the control of the government the way that the CEO of Apple or Amazon has control of their organization. Um, he also believes that many right wingers used to be left wingers 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and that there tends to be kind of this trend, and the right is kind of this what he calls the pimple on the ass of the American left, kind of this opposition, controlled opposition that really is just tacking them along a little bit slower, and that there's sort of this Whig history direction. I know you disagree a few points there, and then he also, he sort of talks a lot about this idea of the cathedral, or this sort of set of institutions that coordinate in a decentralized way. It's kind of emergent collusion that kind of manufactures a consensus, and that sort of de facto, runs our country.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I mean, I sort of I feel so boring to say that I believe elections matter, and if you want conservatives to win, you should vote for conservative politicians that do conservative things, and same if you're a liberal. Um, yeah, and the the idea that like you should run a country like a corporation. It's like I become much more bearish on China in the last few years, and I should write about this. It's like if it worked anywhere, it should have. And I think that Yarvin's answer to this, but bear with me that it's like it should be like. Because it's not a monarchy, maybe because Xi Jinping doesn't pass it on to his son. Maybe that's the problem. But like China, in a way, is like a very highly technocratic. They based on merit without like affirmative action or any kind of weird distortion. They have a bunch of smart guy engineers, and I don't think they're doing too well. They're terrible on birth rates. They went crazy with COVID. Their economic growth has slowed. I mean, they've done well economically over the decades, but they're East Asians, and they haven't done that well for East Asians. They've done well compared to other third world countries. And so you have I think you can answer these questions in the abstract, like is democracy better than dictatorships? There are monarchies in the world that Curtis can point to, and is free to argue that they're run better. North Korea, in theory, 3 generations should be the best run country in the world, right under Yarvinism. And I think historically, like the idea that democracy is incompatible with freedom. I mean, compared to what? I mean, the industrial revolution. There's these places with democratic representation. For their time, like the U.S. and the U.K. Um, good representation for the time, and they had free markets and economic growth. And so, yeah, I want to. Yeah, I want to sort of dig more into this, monarchy idea, and like what his sort of reasoning is and how it incorporates like the lessons of history.
Yeah. I think one other point he makes, and that dovetails with sort of this sort of Patrick Deneen, or this sort of like group of thinkers that's trying to figure out what's after liberalism. They say, hey, it's brought us this amazing growth, but also there's been sort of this like spiritual malaise, or where sort of like the destruction of families. It is like people are less happy. There's all sorts of like negative effects that have emerged as a corollary. And Curtis likes to bring the example of, hey, if you took the same technological and economic sort of situation that we have today and imposed it back onto the 1950s, but imposed sort of 1950s sort of state of the family and the community and the culture, which is a better place. And he says that we're too often long to think that things are always getting better, but what if outside of this, outside of economics and technology, they're getting worse? Is it part of you sympathetic to that, or no? Because they're a package deal.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I do think that, yeah, I do look back. I mean, I do look at so it's gonna sound like a stupid example, but I look at like athletes, and they would talk in interviews, like thinking of basketball mostly, and like how they behaved compared to like the kids today, like Michael Jordan or Charles Barkley's confidence compared to like LeBron James or like Kobe Bryant, when he was alive, and they just seem so much like more confident in themselves as men. I mean, it's hard to explain, but I do feel this like very strongly when I watch like people from the 80s, and like I guess it starts to change in the 90s or early 2000s or so. Um, and yeah, people just seemed better. And yeah, I mean, I do think like we have polls on like increasing happiness. I don't know if we can buy them or not. I don't think they're that reliable. They tell us that much. Uh, but yeah, I'm open to the idea that outside of technological growth and all that other stuff, which is good. Maybe humans are not as happy as they were in the 70s and 80s. Maybe, I mean, my presumption is against that, just because there's some evidence that money is good with happiness, and you just think common sense. It's sort of intuitively correct. What this has to do with like dictatorship versus democracy. It wasn't like the U.S. in the 1950s. There was like I think Curtis does like FDR sort of as his model for quote unquote monarchy. But it's not like FDR planned it was a historical event, right? It was like after World War II, it was like the times of basic economic growth, the basic technological growth, a lot of the low hanging fruit of like air conditioning and refrigerating coming to fruition, the war being over, the existential stakes of Soviet Union before secularism, before these Marxists and like civil rights and all this other stuff sort of sowed confusion and bad policy into into public life. And it's not like this was like dictatorship or democracy, or it was like somebody planning. It was like the good things about the previous generation were sort of a historical product. And I don't think it's like, oh, you have a tariff today, or like you have more religion in government, like you're going to move us back to the 1950s, right? That if you think that that's good, like there's no first, there's no going back because it's a technologically different world. You can't have you can't have that society with like new technology, whatever it looks like, whatever you like about that. Like if we're gonna bring that back, it's going to be given the technological constraints and reality of today's world, right? But it's not like necessarily like whatever economic policy or social policy that preceded it was like the cause of that. There was some other cause, and this is like historically sort of. I think looking to the past even for like guidance maybe is like good for like showing you what's possible and giving you ideas. But like when people start to think they can recreate it, I think that's where they go astray. I think that's where they adopt policies that are not conducive to the goals that they seek.
Yeah. It's well, and the question is, do you recreate it on a policy level or on a cultural level? Um, and if you try to do it on a cultural level, there's also a question of like how much
Yeah,
of these are a package deal, like how much of these sort of the technological and economic growth needed to come from sort of
yeah.
the liberal
Yeah.
values.
But there's no recreation. Even say recreate, there's no like 1950s plus iPhones and
Yeah,
YouTube, right? That doesn't exist. It has to be whatever you like from the 1950s. Like it has to be somehow consistent with whatever we have today.
right, right. And this is Aaron Sabarium has written about sort of this like even if you did believe that sort of this going back to the sort of dating and sex question that these have led to that we should go resort back to traditional values or traditional norms around dating, like it's too late, you can't.
Yeah, yeah. It'll be like mom. Like the next trend will, if it exists, will be like Instagram influencers who instead of showing their breasts are going to be showing their kids off, right? And people are going to see that and think that's cool. It's not going to be like going to the arcade and like getting a Coca Cola like in the 1950s, right? It's gonna whatever you like. It's gonna have to be sort of consistent with reality and sort of where society's going.
For the people who are thinking about like what's after liberalism, post liberalism, do you think they're pretty confused and sort of this is it, or slight moderation to it, or how do you make sense of like the post liberalism conversation?
Yeah, I don't even. I mean, I don't like the. You know what I think they're doing. Like, I'll give you my like sort of feeling about this. Like, I don't know what that means. I don't know what post liberalism means. Like, we still have democracy. We still have capitalism. These things are not going away. We still have. We're not on a verge of like a great awakening. Great awakening. Forget a great awakening. No, like we're not on the cusp of like some kind of religious revival. So like whatever you want to call liberalism, it seems to be continuing, and it seems to be here to stay. I think a lot of these post liberals are just religious, and they're like they can't just directly. I'm not going to say about their intentions, but like my sort of impression of sort of like what's psychologically driving them is like they're just religious and don't like secularism and don't like trans and then so on and so forth,
I think that's a
and
big part
like
of it, but I also think there are moderns or non-religious people who just say, "Hey, this is a death cult. Like this is we're just as you mentioned, once it hits modernity, the people start having less kids, and this just can't hold, and maybe making the
but a
individual
lot of those
yeah
people do like they do like Japan, or they do like these South Korea or these countries with like worse fertility rate than us. So if it's like the death, then like no, America's not the worst or like close to the worst. I think that it seems that what they dislike is too much license, especially sexual freedom and secularism. So you have to sort of look at like what gets people angry and what doesn't get people angry. So if it's like, yeah, it's just about kids, well, America's not that bad. There's a lot of countries that are much worse, right? But if you sort of like the low fertility countries a little bit better, and you're posting like memes of like Greek and Italian villages where like where there's no young people left and the TFR in those countries is like 1.2, then it's not about that seems to be like putting a utilitarian gloss over what are different concerns.
Do you think underpopulation is one of the biggest sort of issues that the world is facing, and like should people be spending more time focused on that, or caring about that, or not really?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love kids and I love people having kids, and I think they should, and I think especially well-off people who can afford it, I think should have kids. Yeah, I mean it's good. I mean, there's like the population growth in of itself, all else being equal, people sometimes have this like Malthusian views, but I think Julian Simon, old economist who wrote these great books on this topic, I think he's absolutely correct. And it is something worth thinking about, and I don't think we've even like begun to like scratch the surface of like treating this like a problem, right? It's very sort of right coded, but not even like it's not even like that right coded because it's like it doesn't register and like the it's not one of the top 50 things like Republicans talk about. Definitely not something Democrats talk about. So there is like a cultural sort of consensus that like we don't worry about fertility or we just talk in the language of individual rights and don't worry about fertility or future generations. And I think that's the thing that needs to change. I see, hints of it, like you see, like Elon Musk and other people talking about it, but we're a long way from this being a mainstream concern.
You wrote in a post once that American politics over the next decades will, to a large extent, be shaped by what the tech right does. Talk about why you think the tech right, which seems pretty small today, will have such outsized impact.
Yeah, I mean, because they're the people with a lot of prestige and a lot of resources. I mean, Elon Musk, we talked about him buying Twitter. This is just one man making one decision, right? I think it's clearly shamed the political culture. It's going to change it in predictable ways. It might be bad for conservatives because they become too online and they can't win elections. I think there's a side they might win the boycott. They might win the war of target LGBT and the war of Dylan Mulvaney and lose the U.S. Senate and the Supreme Court, which would be a pretty funny outcome. So it's going to be unpredictable. But yeah, I mean, if one tech entrepreneur can buy a company and just change sort of the state of the debate, I think that's an indication that money matters, resources matter. Substack is smaller than Elon Musk, but it's had a big impact. And there's like people who are like sort of putting their nose to the doing things that are less flashy, but like what Joe Lonsdale's doing with the Cicero Institute, having really having some policy successes. I think like there's not only going to be so many Elon Musks or Andreessen or Peter Thiels. I think that like the idea of like people like Lonsdale like doing what he's doing on issues they care about, going a little bit under the radar and not getting that much attention. I think it's going to be important in our politics going forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it is interesting. Balaji has this idea of the gray tribe. Like there does seem to be this desire to create sort of this like class consciousness around tech people that is not left, but not exactly right. They're pro-choice, they're pro gay marriage, and they're not proles. And so um, it's an interesting question as to whether they should just like join the right or take over the right, or sort of certainly politically they should, but even like aesthetically or culturally, should they lean into this idea of the gray tribe where you sort of put together this hodgepodge of sort of independent groups, or if you just say, hey, we're taking over the right.
I really like the idea of like, there's really not that many huge issues, right? There's like, I like prediction markets. I like reforming the FDA. I like getting rid of civil rights law. I like cutting taxes, which Republicans will do anyway, anytime they have power. That's one. And so like, you don't need that much. I think that like if you focus on like those four things and maybe one or two other things I'm forgetting, you could have a major outsized influence and change the country. And then like the politicians are going to do what the politicians do. They're going to have to speak to the people, to the concerns of like rural West Virginians and so forth. I mean, they're going to have to talk like them and look like them and act like them, not like Silicon Valley tycoons. But yeah, but they should like keep doing like podcasts like this one and speaking out on social media and like changing the culture and like talking about fertility and these things that have a cultural influence. I think I think like policy should probably be more narrowly focused, and then like room for sort of big picture conversations, cultural shifting like we're doing here.
Yeah. Totally. And speaking of people who've done that in a big way, Vivek, you were early on Vivek mania. Any reflections on Vivek as time has passed, or do you think in this sort of post Trump era, which as you mentioned could be 10 to 20 years from now, but could also be much sooner, if something happens to him, do you think Vivek is here to stay? Do you think he has long term potential, or at least his ideas, or what do you predict is the post Trump future?
I think he personally is here to stay. I think Trump is, he probably has a position in a Trump administration. I mean, he's been like the Trump seems to like him more than anyone else who's running for presidency. Trump seems to be the most friendly to him, um, and so yeah, I mean, he has it. I mean, he has the charisma. He has the appeal to voters to come from. to be like tied with DeSantis. DeSantis had such a big profile being the governor of Florida and having all these accomplishments. And for Vic to be like just behind him, like by not that much after all of this, I mean, is an incredible just accomplishment. I mean, it shows incredible political talent. Forget like whether you think he like seems likable or whatever. He's obviously got the skill. And so yeah, I think Vivek is here for the long run. There's not a natural place for him to like go. Like he could run for Senate, but they have the Senate. JD Vance is there; he's going to block him, and then you have one more senator. I think there's a Sherrod Brown, but it's too late. So there's going to be a 2024. There won't be another Senate, seat in Ohio open until 2030, and if the Republican wins, it's going to be a Republican incumbent. So he doesn't have a natural place to go. Senate is sort of where you might go. Governor, like to become a governor, is sort of different. It's like it's a state level thing. It's a very more parochial thing, I think. But like I think like as like an ideal leader and like a person who can be a vice president or work in like a cabinet agency, yeah, I think he has the potential to do something like that.
Yeah, and gearing towards closing here, the book is Origins of Woke. Highly recommend people read it. What are you hoping is the legacy or impact of this book? There's a beautiful book cover.
We didn't talk much about the book, Eric, but that's okay. I appreciate it because like I've probably done 15 podcasts and shows on this. So yeah, this is the book. So yeah, I'm glad we got to talk about some other issues. Yeah, yeah, I recommend people buy it. I'm hoping that people just look at it. And I hope that people it's a very specific book. Not many books are like this. Not many books have an entire chapter. If you're, a judge, if you're a legislature, if you're going to be the next president or advising the next president, right, or you're assistant to any of these people, this is exactly what you do, and this will, change the law, and potentially, it's going to change the culture. So yeah, I think it's like, one of, not mysterious or sort of hidden, like what I hope the goal, the book's going to accomplish. I quote Hayek. I loved Hayek wrote to serfdom. At the beginning of the book, he says, this is a political book. I think if you write a political book, you should just say so. Mine is a political book, and it's also a work of sort of history and social science. And yeah, it's all there in chapter 6 or 7, whichever is the chapter where I tell people exactly what I want them to do.
Well, that's a perfect way to wrap. We're right at time. I highly recommend people buy it. Also, listen to our first interview in Upstream as well, where we go into some of the ideas. And then, yeah, Richard's been on a podcast tour where he goes even deeper. So, highly recommend checking those out too. Richard, thanks as always.
Thank you, Eric.